that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to be covering a lot of different topics in this first hour related to what's going on in the news. Second hour today, we're going to talk about the Scopes trial, 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial that took place in Dayton, Tennessee. And we have a guest in studio that has actually done a doctoral dissertation on William Jennings Bryan, and a good section of that has to do with the Scopes trial. We've also posted a very good piece by John Stonestreet on the Scopes trial. So we're going to focus some time and attention on that in the second hour. Of course, it also gets us into the issue creation versus evolution and a number of other topics. So that, I think, I certainly would encourage you to look forward to hearing. But let's, if we can, get into some of the issues in the news. And this first one comes from John Solomon, somebody that we could have on, but I think this two-page summary is good enough since he appeared just recently on Real America's Voice. John Solomon is an investigative reporter. We have quoted him many times, and in some respects, this article might be encouraging to you, because we've always said, what are we going to do with this issue of the deep state? Now, some of you might say, well, what is the deep state? I'm holding up our booklet on a biblical point of view on the deep state. I do that because some of you might say, well, I'd like to read a little bit more about that. Maybe there's an article or book in addition to your booklet that I can get. And again, that's one of those resources I might want to recommend that you get. Of course, you can type in the word deep state and you get all sorts of interesting responses to it. But the concern is this. I've heard it from you so many times. Is there going to be any accountability? And the argument is, in this article that Sarah Arnold pulled together of some of the interview that was done with John Solomon, is that the Department of Justice right now, really behind the scenes, is building a conspiracy case against the deep state. They are wanting to uncover this conspiracy case that was in the deep state, which was an attempt to stop Donald Trump. This was hatched even before he ran for president, before he became president, and has continued on to this day. The argument is that there has been this 10-year, according to John Solomon, effort by people in the so-called deep state to undermine President Donald Trump. And John Solomon believes the case could bring the kind of accountability that so many of you have asked might actually take place. He was on, again, as I said, the Real America's Voice, and he said the probe really spans from before the launch of what is called Crossfire Hurricane, which began in 2016 and went all the way through 2024, covering what he described as a coordinated effort to block President Donald Trump from becoming president, and then to use it against him when he was president. And so here's one of the quotes from John Solomon. He said, I think next week, over the next 10 days, the base who has been wondering, where's all this accountability, they're going to get some big surprises. It's been masked by a lot of the infighting and drama and soap opera stuff. I'll get to that in just a minute. But the truth of the matter is the base of Americans are going to be happy when they see where this all is headed. Now, the soap opera issue, if you're not familiar, and I will get into some more detail in a minute when we talk about the issue associated with human trafficking and, of course, Epstein, but nevertheless, let's, if we can, go back to one of the other issues, and there's been kind of a point-counterpoint between Dan Bongino and Pam Bondi, I should say, Attorney General. And so in some respects, that's what he's referring to in terms of the soap opera stuff. He went on to say there's a conspiracy case that opened up, and there's a very large window. He says, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a special prosecutor named by Pam Bondi in the next week or two. So again, John Solomon is dealing with this issue at the same time when he was asked in the interview, what about the rumors that maybe Dan Bongino, even the FBI director Kash Patel, would step down over this confrontation between Pam Bondi and Dan Bongino, and he really kind of dismissed that as significant. And some people have even wondered if over the weekend, where you saw Donald Trump giving his full support to Pam Bondi, an attempt to try to alleviate some of the tension right now in his cabinet. Now, interestingly enough, many people have suggested that Pam Bondi, who is, again, the Attorney General, could actually select a special prosecutor. But others have suggested that maybe it would make more sense to actually have her be reassigned as a special prosecutor because of what they're referring to in this article, the hyper-partisan courts in the District of Columbia. John Sullivan said you don't have to necessarily bring the grand jury, the indictment in Washington, D.C., where 90% of the Democratic jury pool wouldn't convict even if they had a murder. That's a little bit of hyperbole, but you get on that. So they're saying that since some of the conspiracy involved Mar-a-Lago, that could actually be brought to the state of Florida, and there may be sufficient reason to actually bring it there rather than Washington, D.C. So as we are seeing some of the soap opera unfolding right now between at least Dan Bongino and Pam Bondi, and maybe a little bit of Kash Patel, this comes in sort of the middle to illustrate that maybe some of this will be resolved. Some of it already is resolved, but more importantly, those of you that for some time have said, are these people going to get away with this? And the answer is possibly that they will. So again, let's, if we can, go just before we take a break to what we might call the Epstein files. Robbie Starbuck puts it this way. He says this new memo that came from the Department of Justice, and he's very critical of Pam Bondi, might away, admits that there are countless victims of Epstein on video, but no client list or evidence of other rapists they can charge. And that just doesn't seem to make any sense, because they are even making the claim that Epstein wasn't using videos as blackmail. So again, he raises this question. So Epstein was trafficking these underage girls to nobody? Is Pam Bondi serious? No one who has been following this for years believes that everyone who went to Epstein's Isle was there just to catch some waves and relax. Again, no one believes this for any good reason. What Epstein and his ilk did was pure evil, and this memo attempts to just close the book on it like no one else was involved. And I think what you kind of see is there is a growing tension, a significant amount of tension about the fact that indeed we aren't necessarily getting the full story. And either, as some people have suggested, there was never a story there in the first place. And so when you have the Attorney General Pam Bondi saying, I have the client list on my desk, she's just bragging about something that doesn't exist. Or we do have it, and it involves maybe too many people in the deep state, too many people in the area of intelligence that as a result do not want that information to come out. So we'll see how this unfolds in the next couple of weeks. But I just thought, if nothing else, we would start out with that very significant issue of, do we and can we expect any kind of accountability? Because I think that's going to be a really big issue in the future. And so I wanted you to see that article. We come back, a very good piece by, again, Jonathan Turley, individual that we quote from time to time. Matter of fact, just a little bit shocking at how strong his statements are, but we'll get into that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
During debate on the domestic policy bill that Trump named the Big Beautiful Bill, one number was constantly cited by critics and the media. Now that the bill became law 10 days ago, we will see it cited in next year's election in attack ads against members of Congress that voted for a bill they claimed to be a budget blowout. The Congressional Budget Office claimed the bill would increase the federal deficit by $3.3 trillion over 10 years. The editors of the Wall Street Journal call this figure the Great Budget Baseline Con. The CBO score of the bill would only make sense if you assume that Congress was going to tolerate a $4.5 trillion tax increase.
That would be the result of the 2017 tax reform expired at the end of the year, as most of the individual tax provisions are scheduled to do. Even the Democrats in Congress were not prepared to let all of those tax provisions expire. They might not have wanted to extend the tax cuts for top earners, but they certainly would have extended them for most other Americans. The editors lament that in any rational world, changes in the law would be scored against current policy, but in Washington, they are scored against CBO's current law baseline, which assumes that the 2017 tax cuts will expire. They concluded that there was much in the bill that deserved criticism, but the $3.3 trillion deficit critique is phony, like Beltway accounting. I mention this concern simply to remind you to look at government statistics with skepticism. I doubt Congress will demand the CBO to change its accounting methods. I think we can see that neither party wants to do the hard work necessary to achieve a balanced budget. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Before we get back into the issues in the news, let me just pick up a piece that came from Friday. You might remember that Kelly Shackelford was announcing that on Monday they would release their Religious Liberty in the States Index. This is the first time they've done that. And he quietly said that he was going to also be with the governor of the state that was number one. Well, the state that was number one was Florida. And today you had not only the Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, but you also had Kelly Shackelford, who's the president and CEO of First Liberty Institute, and Dr. Mark David Hall, who's been in studio with us, and certainly we're going to be talking about his book about the Christian Foundation of America, but he also heads up the Religious Liberty in the States Project. Well, anyway, I thought it was very interesting that Governor Ron DeSantis said that Florida holds several number one rankings, leading the nation in education, economy, and tourism, and now number one in religious liberty. So you can see he kind of like that. He says, we're grateful for this recognition for First Liberty Institute, which has just named Florida the number one state in the nation for protecting religious liberty. Religious liberty is critical to the foundation and function of America, and I'm proud that Florida excels in protecting this right. Kelly Shackelford at that same press conference said this year's findings show clearly that states taking legislative action are pulling ahead. Under the leadership of Governor DeSantis, Florida passed real laws to protect real people, and now the Sunshine State is the national leader in protecting religious liberty. It's time for more states to follow Governor DeSantis' example and adopt strong religious liberty laws. By the way, one of the cases that they might have go before the Supreme Court involves Florida, but that actually goes back before even some of these actions were taken by the legislature. The index actually looks at 47 distinct legal protections grouped into 20 different safeguards, have added some additional ones. And as I said just the other day, it doesn't break down naturally into red and blue states. For example, number one, Florida, number 2, Montana, but number 3 is Illinois. I think most people would say, Illinois, that's a blue state, yes, but many years ago, because you have quite a number of Catholics in Illinois, and maybe because they were reacting to some of these different laws, Blair laws and things like that, passed a lot of protections. And so number 3 on religious liberty protection is Illinois, then Ohio, then you have a number of southern states, Mississippi, Arkansas, South Carolina. Number 8 is Washington, again, another blue state. But you might think, well, I'm sure at least, even if they're not red and blue states, southern states have a lot of protection of religious liberty. And you would be wrong. For our listeners in Georgia, it's 36th on the list. For our listeners in North Carolina, 44th. So good voice to say maybe they have more work to do. Michigan is 48th. Might also mention Alaska is 37, so there's more to do up there. And while I'm mentioning that, next week I'm going to be in Alaska, and I thought I just might mention that we'll be with our good friends there in Fairbanks and North Pole, Alaska, KJNP, and that'll be Thursday, July 24th. So you might want to mark your calendar if you are in that area, because on Thursday, July 24th, we'll be doing a remote broadcast from the studio. But then after the program, the staff there, KJMP, will be serving lunch to all of our guests. So if you'd like to watch the show live and you would like to have lunch with us, you might let them know. And I'll mention that a few more times, but that's, again, Thursday, July 24th, as we broadcast there from KJNP. So just a lot of things going on right now. But again, this Religious Liberty Index has been published, and we can certainly put some of that information up there as it is available. Let me also then get into this very good piece by Jonathan Turley. As I read this, remind yourself of the fact that here he is a professor at George Washington University, would probably describe himself as left of center, but nevertheless is really concerned about what is happening right now. Because he says America's useful idiots, the left calls for revolution as the ultimate virtue signal. It's a lot stronger than I've ever heard him say. And he reminds us that during the Cold War, Soviet communists repeatedly referred to American liberals as useful idiots. Not sure where that came from. Did it come from Lenin, Stalin? Really doesn't matter. But it was the idea that oftentimes there were individuals in higher education, in Hollywood, and others that embraced Marxism, didn't even understand the implication of it, but they were, in a sense, helping advance the communist message. What Jonathan Turley is saying, now that he, of course, has students all the time, we're now seeing the rise of a new generation of armchair revolutionaries who are calling for everything from the overflow of the U.S. government to the seizure of factories and homes. And he's really talking about this emphasis on socialism. Just a few minutes ago, I held up one booklet that I thought would be helpful to you. This one on socialism is one that I certainly would encourage you if you'd like to get a copy of it. We have one on capitalism versus socialism, and then just one whole one on socialism. And some of you might say, well, why do you hold up all these booklets? Well, partially because I recognize that most of you are not going to sit down and read a book on socialism. If you do, I would certainly commend you the book by Dinesh D'Souza on the United States of Socialism, or maybe one of his historical books like Friedrich Hayek on the Road to Serfdom, but let's be honest, you're probably not. But if you wanted to give it 10 minutes, this booklet is an attempt to give you some of the basics and the responses to some of those issues, and the kind of thing that you can hand to a child or grandchild that maybe has really bought into that. But one of the reasons Jonathan Turley brings that up is because we look at the Democratic mayoral candidate in New York City, Zohran Mamdani. And here is an individual, as he points out, that was a really a privileged son of a radical Columbia professor and Hollywood producer, went to an elite college where tuition is $70,000 a year. But even in his speech to the young Democratic Socialists, called for them to seize the means of production in America. Matter of fact, here's the direct quote. Right now, again, this is Mamdani speaking, if we're talking about the cancellation of student debt, if we're talking about Medicare for all, these are issues that have a groundswell of popular support across the country. But then there are other issues that we firmly believe in, boycott, divestment of Israel, whether it's the end goal of seizing the means of production, where we do not have the same level of support on this this particular moment. And so he's calling for not only seizing the means of production, but he's also called for the seizure of unoccupied luxury condos in New York so we could turn those over to the homeless. And then also, of course, we've talked about before, pledged to have government-run, state-run grocery stores. How do you think that's going to work out? And, of course, the concern that, again, we see Jonathan Turley expressing is that young people basically are actually more enamored with socialism, and as a result, there may be a real need to address those issues. He again tries to give an explanation. He says many of these young voters, he says, have no inkling of what life was like under socialist and communist governments. They were not alive when the radical shifts to socialism in, first of all, Great Britain, even in France, destroyed their economies and had to be reversed. They did not see the collapse of the Soviet Union or the move to capitalism by China to avoid some of these economic meltdowns. And so, again, he's concerned that you see an individual, he's not the mayor yet, but he could be, who has all sorts of proposals which, quite frankly, would violate the Constitution. But even before you could get the government or even the Supreme Court to step in, could just simply bankrupt the city. And in some respects, the idea of seizing multi-million-dollar luxury condos, I think that one's passed beyond the pale as well. And so he's just very concerned about the fact that we are seeing not only individuals like him, but then gives us quotes from a couple of different professors, one from the University of Minnesota, another one from the University of Chicago, and they are just making incredibly blatant socialist, communist kinds of statements, including let's get the United States out of Turtle Island. That may not be real obvious to you, but that's the Native American name for North America, and others that are calling for, as you said, getting rid of the colonialist institutions and the rest. And so he goes on and gives you some very chilling quotes from a number of university professors, so that sometimes people say, where are they getting these ideas? Well, they're coming from the campus. And so again, if we can help you maybe pass on some of the information that we have on things like socialism, that would certainly be the case. And here you have an individual who, quite frankly, would probably disagree with many of the conversations we have here on Point of View. But nevertheless, Jonathan Turley writing this opinion piece about socialism's useful idiots is just a reminder that we're in sort of a battle for the war of ideas. And that's one of the reasons why we encourage you to support Point of View, to support the radio station that carries Point of View, and to take advantage of the resources we want to put in your hands so that you can be more effective. Let's take a break. Got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
As you might imagine, this week we're going to spend some time talking about immigration. Matter of fact, in just a minute, I'm going to talk about, of course, some of the ICE raids and some of the attacks against ICE officials and agents. Tomorrow we'll have a guest with us that will bring some expertise talking about border protection, what is happening at the border, which is a whole lot less, as you might imagine, what the function might be of the National Guard and where we go from here. So we'll be talking about this for some time. But I think in some respects, even as I talk about this issue of the deportation and ICE, as we've pointed out before, one of our articles that we put in our Outlook magazine was the whole issue of how, as a Christian, you think about borders, deportation, and immigration. But this one also brings to a little booklet, and I'll hold this one up too, on media bias. Again, I know that some of you are very concerned about media bias, but the reality is you're probably not going to read a full book on it, although I recommend here 4 of what I think are the best books ever written on media bias. But this little booklet is something we make available just so that you recognize that sometimes media bias comes not from reporting something inaccurately. Media bias comes by not reporting it enough or setting it in context. And Beckett Adams writes it this way. He says the media are really doing free public relations for many of these accused criminals caught in the ICE raids. He says few groups are as susceptible to trends as the press is. And boy, when reporters get on a trend, they commit. I've oftentimes jokingly said that if you think peer pressure only happens in the middle school or maybe even in the high schools, you haven't been around the mainstream press very long because, as he says, the trend now that whenever there's a Democrat-related scandal, the news coverage tends to concentrate on the reaction to the scandal, often by accusing the critics for seizing or pouncing on the issue. And he says, basically, this isn't exactly news reporting, it's more public relations. And he says there's a new fund, if you will, fun, and he's putting this, if you will, in quotes, a new media trend, and this is to report on ICE arrests and deportations in a way that causes maximum reputational damage to the federal agency, while also saying as little as possible, either up front or at all, about the reasons for the deportations. And so, as you might imagine, Beckett Adams gives you some examples. Again, this is all under the umbrella of something we've talked about for years here at Point of View, the need for you to be skeptical, the need for you to be discerning, the need for you to read widely or even read the whole article, as you'll find out in just a minute. He picks on our friends up there in Ohio. The Cincinnati Enquirer talks about this children's chaplain who was detained by ICE. Well, that sounds pretty bad. But again, notably absent, he says, from the headline is the mention the fact that this former chaplain is an Egyptian national whose asylum status was revoked by the Biden administration. Also missing from the headline are mentions of the fact that the chaplain was flagged on the FBI's terror watch list during a background check. And, of course, the chaplain maintains the fingerprints are not his. And so, again, you can maybe say, well, he was flagged by mistake. Maybe the Biden administration made a mistake by revoking his asylum status. But do you read that in the story? No, you have to read other stories or articles to find it. And so his argument is it's editorial indefensible, in this case for the Cincinnati Enquirer, to omit these details from its headline. Editors instead chose to make it seem as if ICE officials had scooped up a hospital chaplain and shoved him on a plane to God knows where. It's not exactly the way it played out. Again, he says that the Enquirer headline and others like it suggest a larger, if unspoken, effort to underreport the seriousness of the charges against certain illegal immigrants and foreign nationals, to oversell their deportations, all in a service of a larger narrative that says the Trump administration's immigration enforcement efforts are sloppy, random, cruel, and haphazard. By the way, are they making mistakes? Probably. It's a federal government agency. Yeah, they're probably going to make some mistakes. But now he talks about all the examples. Let's think about these examples. You remember the Maryland man, that was Kilmar Abrigo Garcia. I think all of us now know about how this was an individual that was certainly not exactly what you might call the Maryland man. He was, of course, an individual who was from El Salvador, living here illegally. Of course, we've talked about all of the charges against him. But then he goes through, we don't just have the Maryland man, we have the Indiana man, we have the Athens man, we have the ice cream man. Well, let's go through a few of those real quickly, just to give you a sense of how, in some respects, these are underreported. Let's take the first one. The Indiana man, well, it turns out that this is a 43-year-old Mexican national who was actually arrested in St. Joseph County in Indiana. And again, you can go through some of the story about him. Of course, you have the Athens man, and I'll be, I think, this fall in Athens, Georgia again. Athens man was actually describing the Venezuelan national who murdered the University of Georgia student, Laken Riley. You have the ice cream man. I'm not making this up. This is all in this article, which I would highly encourage you to read. And the ice cream man turns out to be a 71-year-old Lebanese national who was deported to Beirut from Michigan for alleged war crimes. And at least one of the news agencies did report that he's been accused of torturing and killing 2 Irish soldiers. Okay, that's something. Then you have, of course, the Harvard researcher. We've talked about that before. This was a Russian national who was caught smuggling undeclared petri dishes into the United States. They are concerned about the fact that this was an attempt to maybe infect some of the crops here in America. They found messages on a Russian woman's phone indicating that she planned to smuggle these materials and had taken deliberate attempts to avoid detection. You have the so-called Georgetown scholar, and this was an individual whose father-in-law is a former high-ranking Hamas official. Can you sort of get the idea? Whenever you see the Indiana man, the Athens man, the Maryland man, the ice cream man, probably this is an attempt to try to minimize some of these individuals. And again, you have the DACA recipient, who was in the headline, said the DACA recipient who came to the United States when he was 4 years old, who was reported. But interestingly enough, you have to wait dozens of paragraphs before mentioning that he had been ordered to actually be deported under the Biden administration and ordered in absentia. You have, of course, the veteran who had been in the United States. He was 4 years old, but you again have to go 17 paragraphs until you're informed of a couple of things. For example, he had opened fire on a house party crowd in Colorado Springs, striking a 19-year-old who was 5 months pregnant in the leg. And of course, you have, as I've mentioned before, the Maryland man and many others. So this is just, I think, a very good article that goes on for 3 pages and helps you understand that, again, you don't have to believe everything that you read. If you even read it, you might want to read further into the article. In the case of that particular one, the so-called man who was brought here when he was 4 years old and had to be deported, you have to go 17 paragraphs into it before you find out some of the reasons why he was being deported. And I think it brings us to, of course, the conversation we had just the other day, and that is that we're seeing more and more individuals out there in the streets who want to increase the amount of violence taking place. One activist even said and they interviewed about a dozen of these Democrats from the House of Representatives who said they'd met with some of these radicals and some of these activists who said there needs to be blood to grab the attention of the press and the public. What we really need is for somebody to get shot. And so I think we're going to see more and more conflict
in the streets, more and more, unfortunately, conflict between some of the crowds and ICE officers. And at that time, it would be, I think, very helpful if the press were to do its job and tell the entire story. As I mentioned just the other day, and in the article that appeared last Monday, you have a very good reporting that came from Heather McDonald, who's been on the program before, of a number of incidents that took place at ICE facilities that were never reported by the press. And just not so far from where we're broadcasting today in Alvarado, had nearly a dozen people assault one of those ICE detention facilities. So it's important to certainly look at the violence that is taking place, maybe seriously question whether every deportation should have occurred, but also look at all of the reporting that is taking place right now with some level of skepticism. We're going to need discernment if especially you're required and certainly trying to get as much information just from the legacy press. Read other sources. You'll find out some things that never got reported, and that's a good example of media bias. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention, next hour we're going to be talking with, in studio, Dr. Rick
Townsend, and he has his doctorate from the University of Texas at Dallas, did a doctoral dissertation on William Jennings Bryan. So we're going to be talking about Clarence Darrow, William Jennings Bryan, the Scopes trial 100 years ago, and I think it'll be a fascinating conversation. If nothing else, you will once again see that maybe there are aspects of that trial that have been poorly reported, maybe intentionally biasedly reported, and you'll find out about that, and also get a better understanding of our history. William Jennings Bryan, known as the Great Commenter because he was able to take complex ideas and explain them. We'll get into who he was and how he ran for the presidency and all sorts of interesting aspects of that in just a few minutes. But let me just real quickly take our last article, although I should say the second last article is because our actual last article relates to next hour, and that's a very good piece by John Stonestreet at Breakpoint, The Scopes Trial and the Power of Story, which is kind of a good summary, although in our conversation with Rick Townsend, we'll be talking about some other resources that you might want to obtain as well. But nevertheless, I just wanted you to know that this one here is what I called Grok and anti-Semitism. And you might go, what are you talking about? If you're not familiar, there's a chatbot that, of course, Elon Musk's AI has put together. It's called Grok, and Grok 3 was kind of anti-Semitic. It turns out Grok 4 is anti-Semitic a little bit as well. And so this one sort of pulls together two of the booklets we have, one on anti-Semitism and one on artificial intelligence, which illustrates, again, as somebody that programmed computers in graduate school, there's an old phrase, garbage in, garbage out. And so we'll get into that. But this is very good because Alan Joseph Bauer does a good job, I think, of really reminding us of what's at stake, not just in terms of AI, but in terms of this kind of growing anti-Semitism that is taking place. He says, I have enormous respect for Elon Musk. He has accomplished things and opened up opportunities that only a few years ago people would have considered impossible. He is a genius, a patriot, and appears to be a sincerely good human being. And I would add to that as well, just a great appreciation for his attempt through, of course, the idea of wanting to, through Doge, reduce the size and scope of government, even though he was only there 53 days, I think we figured out. That was not enough. But nevertheless, he's very concerned about the fact that even as he is talking about this American party, he, like I, think it's not going to work very well, but we'll leave that for another day because we really meant to talk about that on Friday. I've seen the attempts to create various third parties before, whether it was the so-called Reform Party, whether it's the Constitution Party. Of course, we do have the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, and others. We'll get into that in the future. But the point he makes really is this. As to Grok 4, it spits out anti-Semitic tropes just like Grok 3 did. He says the Achilles heel of AI, artificial intelligence, will be the programming. Let's say that you're preparing a new AI system and you're programming in information. If your sources claim, and he uses the example, climate change is real, then you're going to say the world is headed for an irreversible disaster. That's the product you're going to get. Of course, he doesn't say this, but if you're programming in all the things that have been said about Jews and Jewish nation, and there's no discernment, you can see why you get these kind of slants that unfold. And his concern is simply this. Anti-Semitism has become mainstreamed. While Grok talks about AIPAC squeezing the American government, he says, while at the same time you have Israeli tourists being driven out of a restaurant in Spain, Jewish family spat on in a Japanese airport, professors in the U.S. feel absolutely no risk when they spew anti-Israel and pure anti-Semitic comments in their classes. You have a synagogue in Melbourne that was set on fire with congregants inside. A nearby Israeli restaurant was also attacked. In England, if someone brings an Israeli flag to hold across from a pro-Hamas rally, that person with the flag is the one that is arrested. And he says this mainstreaming of Jew hatred will far outlast the Gaza war. The conflict will come to some kind of end, but the anti-Jewish teachings at Harvard and elsewhere will continue. And he says, for every bastion of truth, like Douglas Murray, I mentioned him last week as an individual just written a very good book about anti-Semitism and anti-Israel hatred. There are 10 Jew haters that are, and others, thousands on the streets and universities. He says, Jews will do what Jews have always done, circle the wagons. Certain countries, areas, and universities will become default off limits. Today, virtually all Jewish institutions in Europe include police protection. Many of their children are moving to Israel. Of course, I talk about that in my booklet on anti-Semitism. And if there are Jews, then there will be anti-Semitism. The volume has gone up to the point where there are Palestinian flags at even a festival show that he talks about there in England, and much, much more. So the point he's making is that maybe we shouldn't be surprised that when we would expect that artificial intelligence would give us honest, fair, balanced answers, we can see one of the reasons why we should be concerned when anti-Semitism keeps popping up in every one of these AI platforms, and it has shown up once again in Grok 4. Just before I take a break, let me just mention that we have some great resources for you. First of all, there's a number of articles we've posted. We have a take action item to defend parental rights, which you have. If you haven't done, that's an opportunity for you to contact your 2 U.S. senators. My Viewpoints commentary today is on the budget blowout. It's a reminder, as we talked about before, that even though now the so-called big, beautiful bill, or the domestic policy bill, whatever you want to call it, has been passed and signed by the president on July 4th, you're going to hear probably now during these campaigns that what it does is will increase the federal deficit by $3.3 trillion over 10 years. And this is what the editors of the Wall Street Journal call the Great Budget Baseline Con, because the score that came from the CBO, that would be the Congressional Budget Office, would only make sense, they said, if you assume that Congress was going to tolerate a $4.5 trillion tax increase, which was because the 2017 tax reform expired at the end of this year. But even Democrats in Congress were not prepared to let those tax provisions expire. They might not have extended them to the top earners, but they certainly would have extended them to Americans. But they said, again, in any rational world, the editors of the Wall Street Journal said changes in the law would be scored against current policy. But in Washington, they're scored against CBO's current law baseline, which assumes that the 2017 tax cuts would expire. So the point I'm making is, as we've said so many times, just because you see a government statistic, just because you see an article that's in the newspaper, just because you find a particular statistic in an internet website, doesn't necessarily make it true. And if nothing else, it is an illustration once again of looking at how these statistics are used. And I would love to believe that someday Congress would demand the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, to change its accounting methods. But I don't see anybody with any great desire to do that. Quite frankly, I don't see anybody in either political party who seems to be all that interested in a balanced budget. But that's a preview for tomorrow's commentary, which you can find there as well. Well, let's take a break. If you find yourself saying, okay, you went through some of that very quickly, I'd like to hear it again, you can click on that button that says watch or listen. Or, of course, maybe you'd like to find some of the articles, read it for yourself. All of them are available at the website pointofview.net. Next hour, we're going to talk about the Scopes trial. I think it'll be fascinating. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kerby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
100 years ago, there was the trial of the century. At least that's what it was called at the time. July 1925. Hundreds of reporters descended on this small town, Dayton, Tennessee, to cover Tennessee versus John Scopes, the so-called Scopes trial. Lots to cover. We'll get into the fact that on the one hand, you had William Jennings Bryan, known as the Great Commoner, joined to actually prosecute the case. Clarence Darrow, probably a very well-known, maybe the most popular defense attorney at the time. Maybe you have seen the Inherit the Wind coverage of that, which, as you'll find out very quickly, was not as accurate as you might have hoped. And we'll get into everything from what the trial was, what was happening, the issue of creation, evolution, and much more. And to help us with this, we are privileged to have in studio with us Dr. Rick Townsend. He is a retired Air Force fighter pilot and airline pilot. Matter of fact, I might encourage you to go to his bio, because he talks about the different kinds of aircraft he's been able to fly over the years, which is fascinating as well. But in addition to not only being, of course, a very competent pilot, he also has had a great passion for history and received his PhD in the history of ideas from the University of Texas at Dallas. And his dissertation just a few years ago centered on the individual we're going to be talking about, William Jennings Bryan. And he was an individual, of course, that ran for presidency a number of times, the Cross of Gold and all sorts of other things when we talk about that individual. But because of that, also was able to dip into the Scopes trial. We have, of course, information about Rick Townsend on the website. We also have an article that was written by our good friend John Stonestreet, Scopes Trial and the Power of Story. But first of all, Dr. Rick Townsend, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Let's, if we can, talk a little bit about your dissertation, because as I understand it, you were sort of encouraged by somebody else that we've had on this program, the head of the Discovery Institute, and in some respects that allowed you to focus on creation evolution at a secular institution. Pretty interesting.
That's right. Yeah. So John West is the president of Discovery, or I'm not sure what his actual title is, but he's one of the leaders.
I call him the head, whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah.
So he actually helped me craft a dissertation topic that allowed me to focus on William Jennings Bryan and the Scopes trial, but without being too confrontational, at as you say, at a secular institution. So the dissertation focused on the rights arguments that Bryan used to defend all of his causes. So he would always go back to First Amendment rights, so life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or Declaration of Independence rights, or First Amendment rights, which are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to assemble and redress grievances. So he always had some of those kinds of foundational rights arguments to start off with anything he was trying to advance. And the Scopes trial was no exception to that.
And even before we get to the Scopes trial, as I mentioned before, here's somebody who was very well known because he was a presidential candidate 3 times, a loser on all 3 of those occasions. And something you pointed out the other day, which I had never picked up on before, and that is that Clarence Darrow, his opponent in the trial of the century, actually supported him in at least the 1900 election, and maybe even in the 1896 one, but eventually kind of cooled off by the time you got to the 1908 election. But I think it is fascinating for a lot of young people, if they even know anything about the Scopes trial, the sad reality is probably a lot of them don't even know about that.
Correct.
If they know anything, they probably don't even realize how preeminent both of these individuals were. Can you imagine somebody who has run for the presidency 3 times and is certainly a national figure, then in a courtroom dealing with an individual who is perhaps one of the most prominent of all defense attorneys of all times?
Right.
And in some respects, it illustrates again why the stakes were really very high in that particular trial in July of 1925.
That's correct. Yeah, in fact, one of his biographers says that Darrow was actually kind of jealous of Bryan. He was a couple of years older. They'd both gone to law school in a similar time, but a few years apart. And I think Darrow was probably, again, according to the biographer, was somewhat jealous of Bryan's success and also had a great animosity toward religion. So as Bryan became more and more religious through the course of his career after that third run, so he runs again for president in 1908. By 1911, he's being interviewed by the New York Times because of his switch to advocacy for Christian religion and advancement of the gospel.
Yeah.
And so by this point, Darrow has had enough, and he's no longer that enthusiastic about William Jennings Bryan.
There's another name we'll mention a little bit later, and that is H.L. Mencken, because in some respects the bias that we have of the trial is certainly the case. But let's, if we can, bring in at least John Scopes for a minute. There's a lot of question as to whether or not he actually even taught evolution, right. But to give the history, Tennessee had passed an ordinance at the time making it illegal to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. That's kind of a direct quote. And so there was a real desire for this growing organization called the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, to actually use this to get nationwide attention. And so they kind of volunteered, or in one, maybe if you will, encouraged John Scopes to pretend at least that he taught Darwinism so that you have the trial. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's accurate. That's very accurate. The town of Dayton, Tennessee had just gone through a major economic problem. Their major industry in town, the coal mine, had just gone out of business a few years before. They were looking for a way to put the town back on the map. When the ACLU put an ad in the paper soon after the Butler Act was signed into law by the governor in March of 1925, within a month, the ACLU was putting ads in Tennessee newspapers encouraging someone to volunteer to be a test trial.
Right.
So the city leaders thought, well, this is a good way to get us on the map. They didn't know how right they were, but for all the wrong reasons. And so they approached the biology teacher, who was an older man, middle age, had kids, had family, and he declined because he didn't want to jeopardize his job. Well, John Scopes was a football coach and math teacher, never taught biology, but he had substituted in the last week of school when they were reviewing for final exams. And so the biology teacher suggested, well, let's get Scopes, because he was there when they reviewed that textbook. Surely he covered evolution. So they called Scopes in. He had been playing tennis at the time. He comes in all sweaty to this meeting of the city leaders in the drugstore, which was the gathering place.
Mm-hmm.
They asked him if he'd be willing to sit for a test trial. And he said, yeah, sure, why not? He was. You get the impression it wasn't that big a deal to him, but he thought he'll play along because he wants to continue to be supportive of the local town and the community. Really didn't intend to stay there long term. He wanted to go get a graduate degree, which he eventually did. So he was kind of the last man standing in the wrong place at the right time.
Let's take a break. But again, when we talk about it being the trial of the century, some people have said the O.J. Simpson trial was the trial of the century for this century. But again, that's the only one that even comes close. We had kind of a Scopes too when we went to Arkansas, and one of my co-authors, Dr. Norm Geisler, and others spoke on that issue. But when we come back, we're going to get into a little bit more of the details, because in some respects, what you have is the back and forth, and then the desire on the part, especially William Jennings Bryan, to actually preach and to give his closing arguments, but unfortunately he died, and so he was able to give some of those as he traveled around speaking, but that's when you start getting the very biased view of the Scopes trial. So anyway, we're going to take a break. We have a lot more to cover. Stay tuned. More right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
During debate on the domestic policy bill that Trump named the Big Beautiful Bill, one number was constantly cited by critics and the media. Now that the bill became law 10 days ago, we will see it cited in next year's election in attack ads against members of Congress that voted for a bill they claimed to be a budget blowout. The Congressional Budget Office claimed the bill would increase the federal deficit by $3.3 trillion over 10 years. The editors of the Wall Street Journal call this figure the Great Budget Baseline Con. The CBO score of the bill would only make sense if you assume that Congress was going to tolerate a $4.5 trillion tax increase. That would be the result of the 2017 tax reform expired at the end of the year, as most of the individual tax provisions are scheduled to do. Even the Democrats in Congress were not prepared to let all of those tax provisions expire. They might not have wanted to extend the tax cuts for top earners, but they certainly would have extended them for most other Americans. The editors lament that in any rational world, changes in the law would be scored against current policy, but in Washington, they are scored against CBO's current law baseline, which assumes that the 2017 tax cuts will expire. They concluded that there was much in the bill that deserved criticism, but the $3.3 trillion deficit critique is phony, like Beltway accounting. I mention this concern simply to remind you to look at government statistics with skepticism. I doubt Congress will demand the CBO to change its accounting methods. I think we can see that neither party wants to do the hard work necessary to achieve a balanced budget. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us Rick Townsend in studio today. By the way, a little bit later, if you'd like to join the discussion, 1-800-351-1212. Let's get the players. First of all, William Jennings Bryan. We've already talked about the fact he ran for the presidency 3 times. Former Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. Was a pacifist, really individual known for women's rights. Incredible orator, really an opponent of big business. Mentioned the Cross of Gold, all those kinds of things. Maybe not a strict six-day creationist, but certainly an opponent of Darwinism. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, Rick, before I introduced the other one, he was wanting to make some closing comments, but because they decided to plead guilty, then he was unable to, first of all, cross-examine Clarence Darrow,
Correct.
And second of all, not able to give his message. So then he came up with the idea that, okay, now that the trial is done, I will go around giving my closing arguments, but then he died. And, the old phrase that history is written by those who are successful, by the winners. Sometimes history is written by those who survived. And since he didn't survive, you then get a very biased story. And so I think, first of all, you have to say that he was a very gifted individual, and he certainly would, just in terms of his own prestige, as you pointed out, be an individual that everybody would come and see. But then on the other side, you also have Clarence Darrow, who was maybe the most popular defense attorney. He was an atheist. So now you had an individual that, according to, of course, Inherit the Wind, was a hero of free thought, of science, of rationality, and really wanted just to bury religion and bury the great religious proponent, William Jennings Bryan, right? And that's how it's really portrayed in the movie, first in the play and in the movie, but that's not exactly the way it unfolded, is it?
No, it really isn't. Darrow, as we mentioned earlier, had increasing animosity toward Bryan. He had a bone to pick. He really was interested in advancing evolution as a theory. He had just come off a very prominent trial with Leopold and Loeb, who were teenagers who had thrill-killed a younger student to prove that they were smarter than everybody else and could get away with it. They made a lot of mistakes. They were caught quickly, and it was clear that they were brought to trial, and they actually pled guilty. Darrow got them out of the death penalty by demonstrating that they had been taught Nietzschean and Darwinian philosophy, and that therefore they believed that they were not responsible for their actions, that they were products of their environment and could do whatever they felt like because what they felt like was right. And so this is only a year before the Scopes trial. Bryan is speaking in various places during that year, and the Lawrence and the Leopold and Loeb case was clearly one of the major arguments that he made, pointing out the problems. Darwin led to Nietzsche in a lot of ways. Nietzsche is 1844. The Origin of Species is 1859. So when he's a teenager, Nietzsche is influenced by Darwin. Within about 10 years, he reads the book as a young adult. And so Bryan saw the way that Darwinian theory led to Nietzschean philosophy, which led to man's action based on those ideas. And that's what he was trying to oppose.
Well, and again, we've talked about this before, the influence of Darwin on Stalin, who actually said this changed his mind, and Lenin, and the influence indirectly on Hitler, and the whole idea of survival of the fittest, and the idea of eugenics. As a matter of fact, the British Eugenics Society, first a cousin, then a son, were the head of the British ones. And so, just all sorts of ideas go all the way back to Darwin. So, of course, Bryan was right about that, and certainly felt the need to defend this idea of creation. But more importantly, he really wanted to critique Darwinism.
Correct.
And that seems to be the issue. And I want to get into that because one of the things you have in the Salvo magazine are all the arguments that were done by Bryan. And if I've counted them up, at least 4 or 5 that I think we can get into. And then you give us the current state of history today and science, and we can see that those arguments being made back 100 years ago are still arguments that are, I think, valid today. So that is certainly the case.
Yeah, I think there's one more point that would be worth going back to, and I would very gently push back on your contention that Bryan was a pacifist. He was opposed to inappropriate use of military forces. So before World War I, he was opposed to U.S. involvement. In fact, he was a colonel in the Nebraska regiment of the Army Reserves, I believe it was. And so he's not opposed to military force. In fact, before World War I, he's opposed to it because he sees us not being consistent with the treaty obligations that we had as a pacifist nation. What happens, though, is he is engaged with some of the literature that's coming out before World War I, most notably Ed Larson, who's author of Summer of the Gods, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the trial. He believes, and I'm not 100% sure how this works because I haven't seen any references to Vernon Kellogg, in Bryan's writings, but this book Vernon Kellogg writes before World War I, it documents what he saw as a humanitarian aid worker before the U.S. got involved, and the fact that the German militarists, acting on the Darwinian theory and Nietzschean philosophy, considered themselves the master race and were subjugating people even before World War I and during World War I, putting them in boxcars and taking them to slave labor camps. We think of this as a World War II thing, but Bryan read the documentation, and before World War I, this was coming out. So after World War I, he goes from live and let live before World War I to we got to do something about this and stop teaching our kids this philosophy after World War I. So he, that's how in the 1920s he becomes an advocate against teaching evolution of humans in the schools.
So again, just a good illustration of that. Just really quick, because I do want to get into some of the arguments that he was making, but the details of the trial, kind of faded a little bit. And then it's probably fair to say, because at least as John Stonestreet points out, you have H.L. Mencken. Now, here is an individual who was not only a reporter but an atheist and really loved to couch everything into a good versus evil, religion versus faith, common sense versus irrationality. And so now you get this very biased perspective that most people have of the Scopes trial, don't you?
That's correct. Yeah, Texans may remember Molly Ivins as a biting, sarcastic person. I disagreed with on almost everything, but I loved reading her stuff because it was so fun. And H.L. Mencken was that for the 1920s. And so he castigates anything that he disagrees with and puts it in humorous terms, but he's really biting in his criticism.
Yeah, it certainly is. So again, I just wanted, as nothing else, to illustrate what we've talked about so often, and that is to really have some discernment. The sad reality is, Rick, that a fair number of young people probably don't even know about the Scopes trial, but if they do, they know the wrong things about it, and so that is the case. But I thought one of the things you did in the Salvo magazine, and I just printed out some of the arguments, is that when Brian went around to speak on these issues, and even in trying to address the trial, I think you broke it down to really 4 arguments that he made, and I thought we would sort of work our way through those because in some respects it's just a great illustration of the fact that 100 years ago, these were very powerful arguments against Darwinian evolution, and 100 years later, they're still very powerful arguments against evolution. One of the things I did in one of my books, Fossils in Focus, is I quoted what Charles Darwin said about the fact that we didn't have sort of the transitional forms, missing links. And I said, certainly now almost 150 years since that time, you would think that the problem would be resolved, and the problem still remains. And so most of what you're going to be dealing with are biological arguments, but the same kind of arguments can be made is the case. So let me first of all say we're coming to a break. And so those of you that like to take some notes, I'll give you an advanced look. One of the arguments is on the origin of life. Another one is on genetics and morphology. There's a third about the issue of chemistry. Does chemistry really help with evolution? And then finally, do we really have any definitive proof of an origin of a new species? Those were arguments 100 years ago. Let's, when we come back, talk about those arguments. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about this. First of all, we have a link to Rick Townsend. This will take you to his YouTube channel, and you can watch some of the videos. And I think you're going to find those to be very helpful. And so there's a couple of series there. There's an evidence series, and there's ones on incredible animals and humans by design and a variety of others. And so we have some links there. We did, at the very bottom, post this article that gives you a little bit of the history. This comes from John Stonestreet and Timothy Paget. The Scopes Trial and the Power of Story. The Scopes Trial and its cast of colorful characters is the story of power of narratives to shape public perception. And so that is available to you as well. So all of it is there. And when we come back, we'll get into what were the arguments being used at the time against evolution, and how do they measure up today, 100 years later? We'll take a break, continue that conversation right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Rick Townsend in studio with us. And again, if you would like to listen to this again or to watch it, maybe you want to send it to others, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, click on that button that says watch or listen, and you might be able to send it off. Of course, you might be watching it right now on Facebook. It's probably there, YouTube, and others. So again, some great resources. But let me now give you an idea of some of the material that was in your article in Salvo. 4 different articles or arguments, if you will, that were used by Brian about evolution and a critique. The first of which was the issue of the origin of life. Darwin was the one in The Origin of Species that talked about the fact that maybe these chemicals could have come together in a warm little pond, and that these chemicals would eventually become the first living cell. Well, back even in 1925, we knew that that wasn't going to work because we would have to believe in spontaneous generation. But we know so much more about genetics. We know so much more about these very small structures, especially at the cellular level, because Darwin did not know them, obviously. If you have ever had a biology class and looked in a light microscope of a amoeba, paramecium, just looks like a bag of goo. But with electron microscopes, which we now have, we've opened up this, if you will, black box and recognized that life is much more complicated at the cellular level. And so, Rick, in some respects, the argument that was used in the trial is an even more powerful argument today, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. In fact, I cite Dr. James Tour, and he says that the problem of describing how life came about has gotten more and more complicated the more we learn. So that idea of Darwin's black box from Michael Behe just recapitulates itself in this case. But Tour is really good. So Brian says that in his time there were 2 camps. One was suggesting that things were spontaneously generated, which of course has been disproven, and the other is that life came from outer space, so directed panspermia. And he doesn't even give lip service to the warm little pond, but that's lingering in the background.
Yeah.
And he says, since these 2 camps can't agree with each other, I'm not compelled to agree either.
Yeah. And
then if we look at today's research, one of my favorite sources is this 2016 Royal Society meeting. The evolutionary biologist, I believe he's Austrian, Gerd Müller, was the keynote speaker. And his article is really helpful in understanding the state of the art on the evolutionary science front. And he has this quote that basically says, we don't have a clue how it happened. I won't read the quote because it's pretty wordy and it sounds very scientific, but at the end of the game, it just...
Yeah.
So James Tour responds, he's more direct, and I love the way he talks. He says, those who think scientists understand the issues of prebiotic chemistry are wholly misinformed. Nobody understands them. Maybe one day we will, but that day is far from today. But the way Tour would have said it is, those who think they understand are wholly misinformed. Nobody understands them. Maybe one day we will, but that is not today. He's very he doesn't pull his punches.
Let me just mention too that Dr. James Tour. Some of you might say, "Well, okay, who is he?" First of all, he's at Rice University. Yeah. Very gifted individual, synthetic organic chemist, but works at the nano level. With all these nanotechnology, and is brilliant, and has been perhaps the person that's wanted to go around with a hammer. Because sometimes with evolution, it's kind of whack-a-mole. Oh, we don't have that answer, don't have that. But he's been willing to knock them all down because there are individuals that always hold out to the hope that eventually we will discover the answer. And I think whether you look at Dr. James Tour or somebody you and I were talking about off of the air, we have a whole book that was written years ago, which was bringing together scholars who have chemistry background, paleontology background, as well as engineering background, who are basically saying, no, it's not that we're going to discover this. We now know enough about chemistry and physics and thermodynamics to know that it isn't not going to be difficult to find. It is, by definition, impossible to find. And so even when you hear them saying, the day is far from today, no, the bottom line is we have nothing to show for actually now almost a century of research going all the way back to individuals that were actually cycling some of these reduced gases in a spark discharge tube, find a few amino acids in the cold trap at the bottom, but recognizing that it's a long way from amino acids to the first living cell. And even those amino acids aren't what you would need, because amino acids are both left-handed and right-handed, and we only have left-handed amino acids. So just you go after one problem after another, after another, after another. And of course, you also are very familiar with some other individuals that have written about this at the Discovery Institute. And again, it's one of those, if you will, Darwin's dilemmas that we can talk about. So the first one, Origin of Life, William Jennings Bryan was convinced that really, I don't believe that life came from another planet, and I don't believe, obviously, in spontaneous generation, because that's wrong. But now we have even better science that are saying origin of life, really a problem. Yeah. So let's get to the second one, genetics and morphology. I think it's fair to say that we didn't at that time, especially during Charles Darwin's life, but even in the 1920s, know that much. We did have, of course, Mendelian genetics, as you point out, but it's very different than what we know, because you didn't even have the discovery of the structure of DNA until you get to Watson and Crick. So help us out with that.
So that's in the early 1950s, Watson and Crick, and of course they get the Nobel Prize for that. It's brilliant. But Brian is pointing out that he likes to, and he always uses folksy examples.
Yes,
so
I know, I love this.
He likes watermelon. So he'll say, I have this watermelon seed. It's white, but it produces a fruit that's green on the outside, then it has a white inner shell, and then it has this fruit that's red, and we don't have a clue how it does that. And then, by the way, it makes more of itself. And so what he was alluding to was, he said, watermelon seeds have a power which we now know resides at least partially in the genetic code. But it's even more complicated than that, because the genetic code, the DNA that we've pretty much understood, have come to understand, that codes for proteins, but that's only part of the picture. It does not explain the body plan and how these cells that reproduce know to form themselves into the right structure for whatever's being built. And so that's the status of the current research, is that there's so much more than just DNA to building a body. And we've now found that there's what we used to call the junk DNA, which is the non-coding regions. Those are probably the operating system for the cell, but we don't fully understand how that works yet. We don't understand what turns genes on and off. It makes one set of amino acids reform into a different code based on the needs of the cell. The same protein, which does things like metabolism and that sort of thing, will break down and reform into something new that's needed at just the right time.
And again, if you just look at DNA for a minute before we get to the other issue, the DNA code has so many pieces of information in bits and bytes that we've actually used the quote, which comes from the head of Microsoft, that we don't have even programs that we are producing today in our computer. I see you've got a computer, probably has a Microsoft operating system, and that in the DNA is more complex than what we have in the operating systems that we have in our most advanced computers. So then when you get to the other part and recognize that the argument used to be that we have junk DNA. This is experiments left over from evolution. It's a flotsam and jetsam of that. That doesn't work as well. And so we find ourselves once again dealing with the fact that, if anything, the argument of Brian back in 1925 is a more powerful argument today, 100 years later, simply because we know of how complex the cell is and how much more specified the information is in DNAs, right?
That's correct.
Yes. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, two more real quickly. We'll talk about chemistry does not explain evolution. We've sort of talked about that a little bit, but again, I thought it would be good to just recognize that that was an argument used 100 years ago and is still applicable today. And then what about the idea that, well, don't we see various creatures arising? Don't we see new species? Don't we see some of this? And so we'll get into that issue as well. And so just because you see different kinds of dogs, they were all dogs. You have different kinds of cats, but they're all cats. You don't have a dog-cat hybrid. What do you call that, a dad or a cog? You don't have that. And you certainly don't have all these new species that Darwin predicted that you would have. The argument is, well, it happens too slowly, but then we look at the fossil record and we don't see any evidence there as well. So we can see that these arguments being used by William Jennings Bryan were still very powerful arguments in 1925. Guess what? They're still powerful in 2025. But we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Rick Townsend. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Rick Townsend with us for a few more minutes, and if you have been paying attention, we gave you the first two, and that is the argument number 1, the origin of life, argument number 2, genetics and morphology, argument number 3, chemistry does not explain evolution. And there was always this assumption of what one scientist called biochemical predestination. Eventually, the chemicals will all come together and form life. And that didn't make sense in 1925. It makes even less sense in 2025, does it?
That's right. Yeah. So Bryan points out that chemical necessity, there's no predilection for chemicals to arrange themselves into a meaningful set of information, which is what we know now is all of what DNA does with the arrangement of the amino acids into codons and then arranging into the proteins and so on. So Bryan says there were 92 chemical elements at that point. Of course, we've discovered a few more now synthetically above that number, but he says they're still the same. There's no change. And he says water has always been water. And so he's not convinced that the chemistry itself can explain the arrangement of anything that would be conducive to the origin of life. And then current research, I quote Doug Axe here as saying that the present theory tacitly assumes the prior existence of entities whose features it is meant to explain. In other words, it's a circular argument.
Mm-hmm.
And so the chemistry cannot explain the information that we have either.
That's so good. And again, you give some of the footnotes there if people want to follow them. But I thought just in the interest of time, we'll move to argument number 4. No definitive proof of origin of any new species. Now, Darwin would look and say, well, look, we've been able to breed different kinds of roosters and types of cattle and horses and dogs and cats, and we have been able to even increase some of the different kinds of characteristics with flowers and fruit and all of the rest. So if we see some minor change, then why wouldn't we also assume and extrapolate that there's major change? But even at the time, there were some questions about that. And one of my colleagues wrote a book called The Natural Limits to Biological Change, because we see that there are some natural limits. There are boundaries that seem to be built into that. But even 100 years ago, Brian countered that this idea of trying to always extrapolate to the next species, or that there's going to be a new species, is not something we're observing, and certainly not something we've observed now after looking at this for 100 years.
That's correct. Yeah, this may surprise some in your audience, but we don't have any definitive proof of any species arising from another species. What we have is evidence of stability or stasis.
Yes.
And so we see in the fossil record animals that exist today, and we would not expect that to be the case. One of the points that Darwin makes relative to this in his comments that he planned to give at the Scopes trial is that if we have survival of the fittest, why do we still have the ancestor organisms? Why do we still have apes if the fittest is supposed to have taken over the unfit? And so in this idea of no definitive proof of origin of any new species, he points that out. And of course, the state of the art today is that there simply is no evidence of that. What we see is refinement of characteristics, as you pointed out. And so what the 2016 Royal Academy meeting, going back to that one, what they said was, well, we're sure that it was a materialistic process. We just don't know fully what it was. And so we're sure that it's now a combination of processes, which, of course, were all materialistic. And they call it the extended evolutionary synthesis, because if you can put enough syllables together, people must think it's scientific.
What I think is so interesting is you have individuals that work in this field, and I'll just quote from one, Pierre Grasset, who is a French evolutionist. And this is an evolutionist who's saying, look, we look at mutations and we expect that they are going to drive evolution. But what we see is kind of a swing to the left, a swing to the right, but no real changes in that at all. And so this mechanism that was not well understood in 1925, which is a lot better understood in 2025, hasn't been exactly what we're looking for. And once again, you quote from the 2016 meeting of the Royal Academy of London, who basically said, we aren't making very much progress in trying to find the mechanisms of evolution.
Right. In layman's language, the way I subtitle that is, no one knows how evolutionary processes resulted in species change. And so that's really the state of the art, is that they're grasping. They call this extended evolutionary synthesis, the people that are advocating that kind of a third way evolution. Casey Luskin of Discovery Institute considers that those people tend to be more interested in conversation, at least, because they know that they don't have the answers, but they're still resistant to anything other than materialistic possible explanations. So it's still limited.
Let's talk about how people can connect up to you. First of all, we have a link to your YouTube channel, and that would be the best one because you have some various videos that people can watch. You've got some series. Matter of fact, you could take this video and put it there as well. So that's one way they can connect up with you. We can certainly provide some other opportunities because in some respects, if somebody would like to know a little bit more about some of these issues, certainly I would point them to your website. A couple times here you've been quoting from, of course, our good friend friends at Discovery Institute. Just down the road, we have the Institute for Creation Research and others. And so there's just a lot of great information out there. And if somebody would like to have you come and speak, for example, on the history of the Scopes trial, because I got a feeling it's going to be in the news for a while here. And certainly we wanted you to be able to know a little bit about it. I think this particular piece by John Stonestreet really, I think, packed a lot of information
That's a great
in a
synopsis.
short amount of time. And you certainly have some great material. We have the Salvo magazine and others, which we can post in the future and people can find out. So if people would want to have you come and speak, you're available, aren't you?
I go where I'm invited.
Yeah. So again, let me just mention that when we're talking about the Scopes trial, there, I think, was a lot of evidence that indeed some of that could have been presented by Brian, but he didn't have a chance to give his closing arguments. So then he went and spoke on it for a while. But you've actually pulled it together and updated it. And I think this is very good because 4 different arguments, again, if you didn't write those down, the origin of life, genetics and morphology, chemistry not supporting evolution, and then no definitive origin of a new species. At least those 4 arguments are certainly powerful arguments. And then you give the status of the current research. And the good news is still trying to find a way to prove evolution, aren't we?
That's right.
So again, one last time, if people wanted to know a little bit more, again, you, of course, have done a doctoral dissertation. You've certainly put together information about Brian, but also the Scopes trial. So I really appreciate you coming today and talking to us here on Point of View.
Well, it's a privilege to be here. I just want to point out we've been part of your listening audience and part of your supporters since the Marlon Maddox days. So I greatly appreciate the work you do and hope folks will jump into that link as well.
Well, thank you. And again, you and I first sat on a table together when Phyllis Schlafly was speaking in 2001. So that's 24 years ago, and that makes me feel old. So if nothing else, that is the case. One last time, let me just mention, as we're winding down the program today, we have, of course, the Viewpoints commentary. We have the Take Action material. We have the video. We also have these different articles that we've talked about, including this one on the Scopes trial, which I would commend to you because it's a very good piece that was put together by John Stonestreet as well as by Timothy Paget. The Scopes trial and the power of story, but it's a reminder that just because you saw it in a movie or you saw a play or you saw it an article in the website doesn't necessarily make it true. And again, if you wanted to know more information about that, you can certainly find that article at breakpoint.org. Of course, we have a link to, of course, the material that we have here by Rick Townsend. We have that on the website there as well. So let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. Again, want to thank those of you behind the glass that have made this possible. Megan, thank you for producing the program. Karen, thank you for stepping in for Steve and producing the program as well as engineering the program. We'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.